Great. Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my early experiences in urban forestry. Then I'll introduce the work of Black Botanist Week, and then I'll talk about um, a current project in Washington Square Park around plants. So I want to say that I'm an immigrant to and settler on unceded Lenape land, and the specific language group of Lenape who call this land their ancestral homeland is the Munsee. I'd also like to acknowledge the enslaved Africans who labored to build New Amsterdam, some of whom later petitioned for their freedom and began to build the first free African settlement in New York City in our neighborhood. So I've been around plants for most of my life, but my professional pathway emerged in the summer of 2001. And this Times article I love. This is like the seminal experience of my urban forestry life. I was a community forestry intern in New Haven, Connecticut, where I was the technical resource person for 7 community groups in the New Hallville neighborhood. And the way this program worked, community groups had to come to URI, Urban Resources Initiative, and propose a project. The organization doesn't go into the neighborhood and make projects. Community groups make projects, and URI provides technical resource, and they also provide funding for materials. So one of the groups I worked with, and they are my favorite group, even though you're not supposed to have favorites, they transformed an abandoned house lot, which you can see in the newspaper article, into a bird sanctuary. They did this over the course of several years. I was only involved with them during their first season, the summer of 2001. So to put this site in context, it's on the right, and this is a 2019 Google aerial. So, you know, there were no trees, there's hardly any vegetation, at least of any height on the site in 2001. And you can see it in the context of its larger neighborhood. It's on Dixwell Avenue, which is a pretty significant thoroughfare in New Haven. And it's more or less across the street from Beaver Pond Park, which is a series of 2 ponds. It's a wetland system. So that park actually has a lot of active human recreation, but it also, the ponds themselves also support a diversity of bird species. So the northern pond, 85 bird species have been recorded there, and 109 bird species have been recorded in the south pond. And so that was some of the conversation that was going on amongst the members of this community group when they were deciding the future of this particular lot. They really wanted to connect to Beaver Pond Park. After New Haven, I moved to Boston and I worked as the city's urban forester. I really like this image on the left. It's a park setting. It's a historic park, Franklin Park in Boston. We're planting a tree, a Washington elm, and there's a diverse group of people representing sort of different actors. There's me representing the Parks Department. There's also my colleague, Margaret Dyson, who was Director of Historic Parks. We have someone from Eagle Eye Institute, 2 people from the Franklin Park Coalition, someone from National Tree Trust who provided funding. And then we have a future urban forester, this little boy, Leighton, and his mom, Allison, and they're part of a local stewardship group around Franklin Park. So my primary responsibility in Boston was to manage the city's street tree planting program. And we planted trees twice a year, spring and fall. But I also sort of pushed out a little bit in my role and partnered with UMass Extension 4-H on the Boston Urban Stewards Program. And the image on the right is from that program. So Boston Urban Stewards, or BUS as we refer to it, introduced young people. So let's see, middle school to early high school. We introduced them to forestry practices and professions. We not only worked in the neighborhoods around their schools, but we worked in neighborhoods throughout Boston. And then we sort of did this like transect of moving from very urban to rural. Um, the girls pictured in this image are Noelle, Tamari, Eliza, Bielka, and Vanessa. And they were measuring the distance between trees on Tremont Street in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. So, I mean, this picture I think really dates me because the kids are using pen and paper and not tablets. um, and now I'm in New York. I was in California prior to New York, but I'm just going to jump ahead to New York. So in response to the Cooper versus Cooper incident in Central Park last year, May, a group of young Black birders founded Black Birders Week, and that sparked just many Black in X weeks, including Black Botanist Week, which was held July 6th through July 11th last year. And our week was spearheaded by Dr. Tanisha Marie Williams. She is pictured in the upper left. And I just want to name the other members of our group: Dr. Knox Makunga, who's in South Africa, Dr. Baranda Montgomery, Rupert Koopman. Rupert is also in South Africa. There's me. In the second row, Maya Allen, Dr. Morgan Halani, Brandy Cannon, Tatiana Soto, Natasha Fontaine, and in the third floor, Itumeleng, Moro Enyen, and Jade Blue. Our organizing committee has a diverse heritage. We're African American, Afro-Latina, Caribbean American, and African. And we're based in the US, the UK, Canada, and South Africa. We also have a pretty wide range of expertise in botany and the allied plant scientists. So as a group, we decided to redefine botany, or botanist as anyone who loves plants. And the mission of our work is to create a safe space for Black botanists to share their knowledge and expertise and experiences. So this was our 2020 program, and we'll also be running a program this year. I think we'll be doing it after the big botany conference in the summer. So we'll definitely be posting on social media when that happens. So every day of that week, we had a hashtag prompt. So I think you can see it pretty clearly, but we had 3 hashtag prompts on Monday, Black Botanical Legacy on Tuesday, Plant Interactions, Wednesday, Black Plant Love, Thursday, Botanizing While Black, Friday, Plant Appreciation, and Saturday, we expanded our community to BIPOC folks in botany. So on day 1, hashtag Black Botanical Legacy, I shared this photograph of my mother, the woman in the left photo. She is the root of my love of plants. I was born in Jamaica, though this is not a photo taken in Jamaica, and lived a large portion of my childhood there. My mom grew roses, decorative plants, and hedge shrubs in the front yard. It was very formal, the hedge, the lawn, nice and tidy. But then in the back, we had fruit trees and vegetables and herbs. And as a kid, if I was hungry, I went outside and picked a fruit, and that was my snack, and it was pretty awesome. When we moved to the US, that was not possible. I took my Jamaican childhood for granted, I think. The image in the top center, you're seeing Angelica Patterson. She's conducting a study of the effects of rising temperature on the ability of trees like the red oak to persist in their current range, and how rising temperatures might affect forests in terms of making them carbon sources instead of carbon sinks. And she uses a shotgun to collect leaves. So she's not hunting in this picture. Um, the collage below her was submitted by the Mafra Foundation in Ghana, and they were just sharing photos of children using plants in their play. So these are the way that they use gourd and gourd seeds in children's learning. And then the image on the right came from a participant on the last day when we were looking at diverse communities are strong communities and being inclusive of people of color in nature. And Margaret Young submitted several photos of the Dismal Swamp State Park in North Carolina, which is part of the Great Dismal Swamp landscape, which was where Native Americans hunted and fished. And it was also a place where enslaved Africans used as a stopover on their way to freedom. And there are several maroon communities that made that landscape their home. So this year, well, starting last September, Holden Forests and Gardens committed to Black Botanist Week to hand over their year-long lecture series to the group. And so each month, starting last September and going through June or July of this year, each of the founding members will deliver a lecture. I believe it's the second Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. So they've been really phenomenal and diverse so far, and I encourage you to tune into future ones. So I won't say anything about this picture of the unicorn. I'll just leave it there and maybe people will get it. Despite the pandemic, a few of us Black botanist folks met in real life to botanize. Like Black botanists are not unicorns. We were physically distanced and masked, and this is a photo of Morgan Halani, Brandy Cannon, and myself. We met up in Highbridge Park in September, and we just walked and talked and looked at plants. And these are some of the things we took photos of. Common jewel weed, if you're going clockwise from the top plant, common jewel weed, Japanese knotweed, American jump seed, or Virginia knotweed, and then burdock. It was a really great day. It was fun to be out with other Black people looking at plants. That said, I am not a trained botanist. As Chris mentioned, I'm an urban and community forester, and my field site is Washington Square Park. So I run this project there called Washington Square Park Eco Projects. And one of our first programs was an online tree map of the park. And there are 340 trees in the park representing 32 species. If you count holly as a tree, then there are 33 species in the park. And this map is available on the website, wspecoprojects.org. We try to keep it up to date. There's a layer that shows trees that have been removed in the last 3 to 5 years, approximately. So of the 340 trees in the park, I wanted to highlight 2, one of which is the 300-plus-year-old English elm in the northwest corner. The other is tulip tree, and there are 2 of them growing in the park. So the elm is over 300 years old. I think it's actually 342 years old based on a bit of data I saw on a Parks Department webpage that's no longer there. But in any case, it means that this tree started its life in the park in the late 1600s. The tree grew on privately owned land until the city began acquiring parcels west of Minetta Brook in 1824 to create the park we now know as Washington Square Park, which was formally designated in 1827. So I like to point out these dates because they debunk the urban legend that this was a hanging tree where public executions took place. So in addition to like the human reaction to this tree, it's like really awe-inspiring. The English elm, it's a non-native, but it has wildlife value in the park. The only mammal we spotted, well, wild mammal we spotted in the park is a raccoon, and it was sheltering in a cavity. This was pre-COVID. This was fall 2019. Um, Not surprisingly, lots of squirrels use this tree for shelter and for food. We see a pretty diverse group of birds using the tree as well for food. All sorts of warblers during migration season. We see woodpeckers foraging there. We also see brown creeper doing the same thing. And the red-tailed hawks use this tree as a perch when they're in the park. So coming to the tulip tree, the historic ecology of Washington Square Park includes the oak tulip tree forest. You wouldn't know that because Washington Square Park has been through many iterations since 1827. And the tulip tree is significant in Lenape lifeways. It's also one of, well, it is my favorite tree or one of my favorite trees. The Lenape used the timber to make canoes, and they would set a fire at the base of the tree, and then they would also use fire to excavate to create that trough in the center of the trunk. The Lenape word for tulip tree, which I've listed below the Latin binomial, translates to tree from which canoes are made. So now I'm going to bring you to two projects that are in their early phases. So we run two monitoring projects. One is a wildlife project. We're mostly counting birds, and we do that bi-weekly, and all our data is put up on eBird. And the other project we have is a tree phenology project. So phenology is the study of seasonal changes in organisms. So not just trees and plants, but all the other organisms. And we use the platform we use is Nature's Notebook. So given my love of my interest in trees, I'd been informally tracking seasonal changes in the park since I moved to the neighborhood over 10 years ago. But in 2019, I took a phenology leadership course from the USA National Phenology Network, and we kicked off formal monitoring in the fall of 2019. We had a really great group of volunteers. We had 2 local volunteers, and then we also had an ecology fields methods class at NYU who came in to collect data. We're tracking the 9 trees shown here: flowering dogwood, 2 Kwanzan cherries, star magnolia, silver maple, red maple, Kusa dogwood, tulip tree, and Yoshino cherry. This is sort of our first round of tree species. Unfortunately, as with many things, the pandemic has put a hold on our volunteer program, but I've been going out to the park and making observations. So as I mentioned, we use Nature's Notebook to record seasonal changes, and some of the phenophases we record are pictured here. We do bud bursts, both leaves and flowers, and on the left, this is the Kwanzan cherry flower bud starting to swell, and the bud scale starting to shrink away from the flowers. The 2 images in the center are of the same tree, the flowering dogwood, which is a native understory tree. Those white structures are not actually petals. Those are known as bracts. The true flowers are in the center, and they're pretty inconspicuous. This phenophase is known as the open flower because you can see the reproductive organs of the flower. And then the image of the right is the fall colored leaf of a tulip tree. You can also record colored leaves outside of the fall season because leaves do exhibit colored leaves if they're under drought stress, for example. So why are we collecting phenology data? Well, one of our goals is to create phenology calendars for each tree that we're monitoring. And basically, we want to be able to um, know or say or show when you can expect different phenophases to occur. And so what you're looking at is data for the tulip tree. We're looking at leaves, open flowers, and colored leaves for 2 years, 2019 and 2020. You can see for the tulip tree, it starts to exhibit leaves roughly in April. And before I go any further, I should say the colored bars indicate that an observer went out on a date and they observed that phenophase. The gray bars indicate the observer went out into the field on a given date and did not observe that phenophase. So you can, it's only 2 years of data, but you get a rough idea that the tulip tree is in leaf roughly April to November. And in that stretch, you're seeing colored leaves as early as July, which could indicate drought stress because July is the summer and tulip trees should not be exhibiting fall color at this time. If you look at the open flower information, which is in the center, you're seeing open flowers sort of late spring. And we're hoping to get sort of more of a better match over time. So there's sort of less discrepancy. And we're trying to then line up specific observation dates for a neater and more predictive calendar. So another goal of the program is to be able to say something about the impact of urban heat island on seasonal changes, and just to look for trends in the timing of seasonal changes. So obviously these are not our data, but these two papers were recommended by the National Phenology Network. And the paper on the left, the authors used human population density. And so you're looking at that top image on the left. They used population density as a measure of urbanization and thus the urban heat island effect. They also used flowering and leaf out data from USA NPIN. And what they find, and they illustrate in the bottom left images, is that earlier flowering and leaf out does occur in areas with higher population density and warmer regional temperature. But there is some context dependency here. You can see that pinch point in those lines. And that's because in colder areas, plants do flower and leaf out earlier, but in warmer areas, sometimes flowering and leaf out is delayed. And the authors offer several explanations, one of which is physiological. And I like to think about this because some people don't like winter, but some species actually need a chilling during dormancy in order to flower and leaf out. And if there's a reduction in that chilling time during dormancy, then flowering and leaf out is delayed. And the next paper will sort of introduce why that's important. So McDonough and McKenzie and her colleagues, they were lucky to find a data set from 1940 to 1959 at Quackenbush in Maine that was looking at flowering and leaf out, and it also had bird arrival data. And then they used more modern data from 1993 to 2012 as a point of comparison. And so not surprisingly, the authors found that plants leaf out and flower earlier in warmer years. You can see the line sloping down. So in this case, it's a tulip tree. Its first flower has come earlier over time, and the leaf out has also come earlier over time. You'll see that's not the case for bird arrival. So plants, it seems, are more sensitive to spring temperatures than birds. Um, while birds are responding to warmer temperatures over time, that's temperature doesn't is not necessarily a primary signal for bird migration. Other things like increasing day length are. Um, but birds are shifting their migration time. There is concern that they're not doing it consistently enough or at the same rate as plants. And this can result in something that's known as a trophic mismatch. So birds are arriving on their breeding grounds um, when their insect food sources might no longer be present. So this is some of what we want to do, and we only have 2 years of data, and so we're sort of working towards that. It's a long-term project. Maybe in 3 years we could do a kind of trend in terms of a phenophase calendar, but for research like what's shown here, it's like something like on the order of 10 years, and we'll need other kinds of data too. Temperature data, rainfall, warming degree days, land use data. Um, so this is stuff we're committed to, which is why we started collecting data in 2019. And let me, okay. So another thing we're starting is a project to compare the phenology of 2 to 3 species across 6 sites in the New York City area. And this map lists the 6 sites. The very far north is Ward Pound Ridge Reservation in Westchester. And someone I'm working with suggested this location. It's sort of beyond the immediate urban heat island zone, but it's also in the same hardiness zone as the other sites. Um, New York Botanical Garden collects phenology data. This person I mentioned, he's setting up a project in the Ramble in Central Park. There's Washington Square Park, Greenwood Cemetery collects data. And there is a group through the Harvard Forest that works with teachers, and they have a location at Brooklyn Tech High School where they're collecting data, and it might be in Fort Greene Park. So that would be the 6th site. So right now we're just focusing on Washington Square Park and Greenwood Cemetery. And these 2 sites overlap in terms of 2 species, the tulip tree and the flowering dogwood. Greenwood is their tulip trees are in Valley Water, and their flowering dogwood is in Vista Grove. So just taking a look at 2 full years of data, 2019 and 2020. Washington Square Park is at the top, Greenwood Cemetery is at the bottom. And I'm just putting this up here because it is only 2 years, and I'm not sure how much there is to say beyond the fact that it looks like fall color came a little bit earlier in Washington Square Park than it did in Greenwood Cemetery. Um, it's hard to really say anything about 2020 because I went to the park and collected a lot of data, that the same number of observations were not made in Greenwood Cemetery. But if you're looking at the first observation of colored leaves in Greenwood Cemetery, it's within the range of what was happening in Washington Square Park. So this is the kind of information that we're looking for and the kind of data that we'll use to make cross-site comparisons. And it'll just be interesting to see what it looks like in Westchester versus in Lower Manhattan. And with that, I'm gonna stop. I do have some bird stuff, but I think I was only